And it's kind of that period of sort of not holding on too tightly, because when you grab something really tightly, that constricts, blood flow, oxygen, creativity. So there's a kind of loose period where you're just like feeling your way into something. And it's the feeling your way into it and the trying things usually brings in that magical moment. And it's very hard to predict and it's very hard to control, I think, but you can get into sort of conditions that make that more likely.
So I talk about those moments as 100% reliable and 98% unpredictable.
That's a perfect summation of it.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to another episode of Might Help, Can't Hurt. Conversations with leaders, doers, and friends. And I'm very excited to have a leader, doer, and hopefully new friend with me, Peter M. Krask. Peter is, he said, bringing up his bio to pretend smoothly that he already knows all about him. Well, actually, no, let me just explain what happened. So Peter people reach out to come on the show a lot. And normally, because I know a lot of people, I tend to go with people that I've already met. But we just loved Peter's whole presentation. He calls himself the creativity guy. And it was actually the first line of his mission, which I shared in the show notes. Creativity can remake ourselves and our world. In a time of enormous change and upheaval, creative dreams and reinventions can't wait. I'm here, this being Peter now, not me. I'm here to help others make those dreams a reality and make sure no one gets lost or gives up along the way. And you also call yourself a project whisperer, which I love. Now I did a sort of a wider search on you a little bit, and you've written operas. You've got a master's from Johns Hopkins, and is it critical theory or critical thinking?
Critical studies. So basically it's sort of learning how to think critically and write. Primarily that was with a bent towards journalism. Like I wrote for a daily newspaper in Baltimore for 2 years, like reviewing concerts and art things. And so it was very process-based training.
Yeah. So now you used the word process a few times when we were talking before the show. What do you mean by process?
Well, I've always been, first of all, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
I really appreciate the invitation. And I think part of the reason we reached out to you is I liked the spirit of the name of your show, which is sort of, it's lighter. And I like the energy of that, because I think sometimes, it's particularly with creative things, people are like, do it like this, And creativity, coaching, any of that, it's kind of an open-ended process. It's a little experimental. And it's always, rejiggering as you go along, as you discover things. So I like that, let's try this. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Yeah. Can't hurt, right? But I've always been very interested in how things happen and how, primarily how we make things. And that can be anything from, an art project or a business or write a show or, raise a family. They're all creative things. And they're all about, having an idea and then making it happen in the world somehow. Yeah. And I'm very interested in what happens in between those two things. Because I think particularly for Americans, we're very raised with the idea of success and success being the pinnacle and, the thing we're all working towards. And in no way am I against success. I want to be a success in my work.
Being on the record, Mr. Krask has stated for the record, he's not against success.
But success isn't very interesting to talk about. I think most of us want to talk about where we are in between those poles, right? This is where I am. I want to get somewhere, but I'm not quite sure how, or I'm trying something, it's not working, What do I do differently? You know, for me, it's like if you read a detective novel, it would be as if by leaving out the in-between part, it's the first chapter is the murder, and the second chapter is the detective says, it was Miss Marple in, you know, the dining room with the candlestick, and mystery solved.
We're supposed to say spoiler alert.
Right. Sorry.
But yeah, so I've got a friend who calls that the bit in the middle.
Yeah. And that's where most of us are, most of the time, I think.
Yeah, there's an old, I think I first saw it on the New Yorker, but I actually bought the rights to reprint it in one of my books. There's an old cartoon where there's a couple of mathematicians at a board, you know, doing very complex maths, and it's, you know, step one, X times, and step two, and then a miracle happens. Step three,
yes.
And one guy saying to the other, I think we might need to be a bit more specific
just
about
a little.
So that would be process.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then the other kind of term I thought it might be helpful to define before we get too stuck in is creativity. Now, I hear it used sometimes as unique ways of thinking and sometimes as creating stuff in the world.
Right.
Where's it fit for you in that?
For me, I think it actually is, it means curiosity. Because it's a kind of openness, or a stance of openness to experience, or thinking, and an ability to sort of stay with something that may be uncomfortable at first because you don't quite know. And you know, because I think generally most creativity usually comes out of this question of, what happens if I try this? Or making a connection that someone hasn't seen before. Like, you know, like if you have kids, like, you know, the way that they can just take an object and play with it, and suddenly it becomes something else that on paper you'd be like, how did they get there? But the kid just says, oh yeah, you know, this paper towel tube is rocket ship. And that's it. Nobody, you know, you just make that leap, and that's a kind
I always think of Calvin and Hobbes.
Yes, exactly.
You know, not just the whole relationship with the tiger, but transmogrifier and all the you know, all the stuff he created out of a cardboard box.
Right. Because the reason I try to keep it to something like creativity or curiosity, or an ability just of asking questions, is I think there are so many beliefs about who is creative or who isn't, or who has creativity and who doesn't, and work that is creative versus work that is not. And I just don't really believe in that. And I find, you know, most people are creative in some way, but if you ask them about it, they're like, oh, I'm not creative. You know, I don't know how to do that. So I always want to take sort of the pressure off that.
Yeah. So something's occurring to me, and you can tell me. I'm inclined for us to jump in the deep end. You up for that?
Let's go. Yeah, that's always the good thing.
So we've been commissioned. Don't know if you know this, but we've been commissioned, you and I, to facilitate a team whose job is to come up with implementable ideas to end world hunger. Okay. So where like, what's our prep? where do we start?
That is a good question. I will start with the question I usually ask my clients, and ask myself when I'm working on a project. And it's very important in asking the question, the tone of it, which is, what are you doing? Now, there's two ways of asking that question. You could say, what are we doing? Or, what are you doing? You know, one of which is going to really jack you up right away.
The one that makes me feel 5 years old and ashamed is not the one we're going for?
Correct, yeah.
Excellent, got it, I'm with you. Yes.
But I think it seems like an incredibly obvious question, but once you start digging into it or separating the layers in it, you can start suddenly finding really good information and really good places to start. So, and answers that you may not have expected. And that suddenly opens up all kinds of possibilities. And the flip side of that is the answer may also be, I don't know. And I don't know is a great answer. I think often we carry a lot of shame about not knowing or having expectations that we're supposed to know. But I think people who have ready access to their creativity are able to say, I don't know, and then see what happens after that. And I think suddenly you've got all this freedom because you don't know. And maybe that's where you find an interesting, unexpected solution that wasn't there before.
Now, are you, we talked about process at the beginning. Are you so let's say we go in to meet with the team, right? And we go, what are you doing? We go, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And they say, well, we're trying to end world hunger. Okay, we're in the game. They know.
So I would take kind of like, maybe this is a Calvin and Hobbes impulse, but can you be, like that 6-year-old who's like says why all the time? And so we keep coming back with that question, well, why?
Yeah.
What happened? Why? And again, we can start finding really useful things.
So it seems to me that there's two versions of I don't know that I come across. One is laden with curiosity, and the other is an end to questioning.
Yeah.
And I think that matters within I don't know.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
There's the throwing your hands up, I don't know, which is why nothing happens.
Right.
But then there's the I don't know, let's find out,
right,
which is a very different energy.
Yeah. Or I'll throw in a third option, which is the sort of, which I think many of us have, which is like, I don't know. And then like, okay, I better, figure it out.
Right.
And I think.
So you don't have to go all the way to enthusiasm.
Right. Because sometimes like, you just don't know. And you're like, well, let's see. That's really a valid one too, because it's still very open-ended. And a stance of like, well, maybe this will work or maybe not.
So as much as anything, it's realizing I don't know isn't the end of the conversation.
Absolutely. It's always the starting point, right?
Right. And I think that in and of itself is very helpful because most people go, well, I don't know. So, on to the next thing.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I think studies have shown, particularly with learning any new skill or activity, that there is the degree of not knowing, which there's one version of that, which is the task is too simple. And you're like, oh, I can figure this out really quickly. You get bored and then you move on. And then there is the task that's just enough beyond your capacity that you currently have, where then you're engaged because like it's within your reach, and you have to go towards it a little bit more. And then there's the one where you just don't know and it's too complex, and that's usually where you get into the like, well, I don't know, I'm out. It's too hard for me. So I think I always want to try to stay in that middle ground because I think it is an invitation to sort of keep going. And it's not, it's fun and exciting. It's a little scary. There's all sorts of interesting energy in there that can propel you forward.
So what I've noticed in most creative projects I've been engaged in over the years, books and plays and movies and all this kind of stuff, there's a point at which it's like, oh, and then you just know. Now, do you that when I talk with other artists and creatives about that, and I apologize for using the words because one of the first things you said is we're all not creative, but when I talk to people who do a lot of that kind of creative work, there's a sort of a shared sense of the magic of those moments.
Mm-hmm.
For you, what are they? Like, what are they and where do they come from?
Well, I have a couple answers for that because it is magical. Like it's usually unexpected, and I think it's kind of sort of the stereotype, or sort of, when we see a movie about somebody who's a maker or, quote unquote genius, like they're just sitting in there, the lightning bolt happens, and they're like, Eureka, I've got it, I figured it out. That moment does happen, but usually what you don't see is that whole period beforehand of kind of sitting around, or the like, maybe I'll try this, or well, crap, this isn't really working. That there is this sort of period of wandering and experimentation, and it's kind of that period of sort of not holding on too tightly, because when you grab something really tightly, that constricts, blood flow, oxygen, creativity. So there is a kind of loose period where you're just like feeling your way into something. And it's the feeling your way into it and the trying things usually brings in that magical moment. And it's very hard to predict, and it's very hard to control, I think, but you can get into sort of conditions that make that more likely.
So I talk about those moments as 100% reliable and 98% unpredictable.
That's a perfect summation of it.
That's my experience, and so it's interesting to me. So you're talking about there are conditions that I always love the notion that most success is a happy accident, but you can become more accident prone.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are for you some of those conditions? Like what makes more happy accident prone?
Just to give an example, I'm a photographer, and I started studying photography fairly recently, so within the past 10 years. And I do a lot of studio-based work and working with other people. So I set up my studio in one particular way. There is, I don't have an assistant, so I have to set it up by myself. So I set it up the day before, so I'm not pooped for the actual shoot. But there's, an order to how I set it up. And I try to do it the same way every time. I'm a little superstitious, but it puts your brain and your body in that space of, oh, I'm doing this thing now, and it's a kind of readiness. So, and I have certain things, like I have an idea of what will happen when somebody comes in for a photo session. And there's a certain kind of nervousness, particularly if it's working with somebody I haven't worked with before. So I try to create a sense of comfortableness, and, that there's not a lot of pressure or, high stakes. And I may have some shots planned in my mind, but it always changes when the person's there, because it's just another person, and then suddenly you're moving in a different way and seeing different things. And 9 times out of 10, I get a pretty good result. So there is something about that container, like making that container and having some guardrails. But it also, I think it's kind of like drawing the circle around something to kind of make it sacred. Like, this is the space where this thing can happen, and if you look sort of historically at, religious practice and religious ritual, part of that comes from the idea of just, we're going to draw a circle around something to set it apart as sacred, and then perhaps some magic can happen out of that.
There's a beautiful, to my mind, definition of genius and creativity. And I remember I was listening to somebody was studying the creative patterns of a French-Canadian actress named Viole Leger, who would transform into multiple characters. She just was one of those people who really became other people.
Right.
And she had very tight ways of beginning and ending each character for herself. Mm-hmm. The way they described it is, she said, genius is madness in context.
Oh, that's
I have to build the cage before I unleash the demon.
right. Absolutely.
And there was something about that that's both vivid and evocative, but it also speaks to, once you've set the game up well, then you really can just play the game.
Yeah. And well, or look at, professional athletes, sort of how highly trained they are and sort of how drilled they are, so that so many things are unconscious. And then in the moment, they're able to respond to everything that's happening around them because those skills, that container was built. There was it Malcolm Gladwell, the 10,000 hour?
Well, he made it. It was a Swedish
right.
scientist, but Gladwell made it famous.
And it's the interesting thing about that is that I think sometimes part of that equation that's missing when it's popularized is that, yes, the 10,000 hours are important, but it's also how you're working those 10,000 hours. Mm-hmm. So it's, if you're a violinist, learning how to play trills on the violin, which is, hard thing to do on that little string. You may have to practice at 10,000 hours, but do you practice that from like, oh my God, I'm practicing forever, and or do you bring an energy of curiosity and love and that sort of that sense of wanting to master something? So then, in performance, you can just let that thing happen. And I think, we all run the gamut of that because there are those days, like you're a writer. I'm sure you've had days where you're just like, what am I doing? Like the words are just not coming.
Days, hours, weeks.
Right. Yeah. And you still show up and you still come back. And then there are the days where you're like, man, I'm really good. This is just, it's coming. I'm getting it on the trail. And, we kind of have to allow all of that space. But I think, it's important that we not be too literal about the 10,000 hours as an example. Like that itself is not a guarantee. It's how you approach it, I think.
So then, is there such a thing as a guarantee with creativity?
Not really. Or I think, all right, I'm going to amend that. I think to go back to what I said earlier about success, when I work with clients, I don't spend a lot of time sort of on the success part because I have no doubt that they will succeed. That, like, to me, that's just never a question.
Right.
They're motivated, they're really invested, they're committed, they're passionate, and they're curious, and they work hard. But the thing that's not guaranteed is the kind of success, or you may not be making the thing you think you're making.
Right.
That happens more often than not, and I think we've all had that experience of you start out, like say you're planting a garden, and you think this is the year I'm going to plant all of daisies or whatever. And then, you find out like it's the wrong soil conditions and, the wrong sunlight exposure. So, you keep having to track based on what's happening in front of you. And 6 months later, you may have a garden that's filled with a very different kind of plant, but you've still made a garden. Like you did meet your thing you say you were going to do, but it's, and I think that's also part of that stance of openness, of sort of like, I think this is what I'm doing, and this is the thing I'm working towards. And I may discover along the way that it's going to be something else. I think.
So what's your, because I bump into that, because I know this when clients come to me, and I've been coaching for 30 plus years. Yeah. So when clients come to me and they say, well, this is what I want, I know that there's a reasonable chance that by the time we're done, that may be nothing to do
with
what they want.
Right.
So how do you present what you do to people in a way that allows for that kind of fluidity? What's your pitch? I mean, you don't have to do your pitch, but like,
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it's about, ultimately what I do for people is teach them their own process, and how to work with their own process, so that they are able then to go and do the kind of work they want to do. And my experience has been people have the answer already. They know the thing they want to do, even if they're saying it's something else. Somewhere they know what the answer is. And part of what I do is, kind of just help clear the path, so they can discover that and get familiar with it. Because, there's so many books about creativity and, so many ways of approaching it. And all of that information is great information and it's very useful, but it also can be a trap because people get into the mindset of, well, it's not working for me, I must be doing something wrong, or, I followed this plan that this person prescribed, and there's probably nothing wrong with that plan. It also may not be the right plan for them, or it may require some tweaking. And sort of learning about process is about sort of like, here are common obstacles we face, here are common challenges, here are things that tend to happen. How do you individually work with that? So I think at the end of the day, that's how I look at it, that I'm ultimately here to teach you your process.
Right. Right. And and does that vary widely, or does it vary a bit within some pretty predictable parameters?
I would say the one thing that is completely predictable is, again, people know the answer. Right. And I can bank on that. And there's, all kinds of resistance, whatever the stuff that obscures it. I think that's pretty consistent. But, and I think also too, teaching people how to trust their own process is really valuable, because again, people sort of know, and it's just really instilling the belief that this is how you do it. And aside from that, then it can vary widely, because endpoints may be different. Somebody working on, who's writing a book, let's say, the endpoint of that may be different from somebody who's trying to develop a business, because the sense that, building a business ultimately is about trying to mitigate risk, whereas writing a book is about taking all kinds of risks. But both people are still engaged in telling a story, and telling a story that comes from within themselves. So it's learning both of those things. But I'm curious, like with your clients, when you find they don't end up where they first said they wanted to end up, how do you work with that? What do you notice?
I was going to say, normally I've spent a fair bit of time up front letting them know that's likely. Yeah. So it's not, I at least can go, hey, remember that conversation we had back when we said. So I've learned to do that, because that helps a lot. But generally speaking, it's almost redefining the end game. That if you've decided the end game is this, and then on the one hand, it does make it easier to create.
Right.
But on the other hand, I find that so much, I find it very different coaching in some ways, businesses than people. Mm-hmm. Because in businesses, there usually is an end result that they're after. And it is usually somewhat fixed. And it isn't, they aren't doing it because they think it will make them happy. They're doing it because it's the next business goal or objective.
Right.
With individuals, there's very often this crossover point where they're not really setting out to create what they want to create. They're setting out to create what they think will make them happy. And so that distinction plays into it a lot.
Yeah,
Because if you actually just want to create something, you can create it. It might be great. It might not be great. People might like it. They won't.
Yeah.
But most of the time, what people are trying to create, in my experience, is a feeling. And creating stuff in the world is just the long way around for that.
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting to speak to that, because that's a really beautiful distinction that you've made, and sort of one that I think allows for all kinds of possibilities. But even within the business one, there is a point where the process is messy and you have to be open to sort of discovery. So like, to give an example from my own work, I was a floral designer for 20 years. I owned my own business in New York, and a lot of my clients were in live television. So that's a very big machine, and production happens in a very particular way, because the endpoint is the camera goes on at 7 a.m, no matter what, and there's no do-over. So you have a very particular, specific goal in mind. But within that, you still need that process of kind of being able to ride with something, or being able to be like, oh crap, that didn't work. I have to figure out plan B, in the moment. And the ability to do that, the ability to function in that way, comes from understanding your own process and being really comfortable in that, because then you can move in it fairly quickly when you need to. Because I've had a couple times with some projects where, just due to circumstance, like the plan we had was not how the thing went down in the end. And in that moment, you can spend a lot of time sort of saying, well, but this was the plan, it was supposed to go this way. Or you can be like, okay, this is what we got to deal with. Let's go. And figure
Well, there's
it out.
something about knowing it's supposed to be messy that helps.
Yeah.
Like, that's the thing, is if people think, well, I'm sure there's a linear plan that can get me from A to B, that in and of itself is the problem. Because then it looks like when it gets messy, you're off track, when actually usually when it gets messy is when you've begun. Right.
Absolutely. And that's where you start finding really useful things too, right? Even if they don't work. Because I think that's one of the challenges, particularly with people who want the linear process, is sort of uncoupling that belief that there's something wrong. Like, if it doesn't work immediately, or if it's messy, that something's wrong. And really all it is just information. And an ability to sort of keep taking in information and moving forward. I think that's really the key. But particularly with anything with, when creativity is put on it as a word, it just drives up people's anxiety so much, because I'm sure we can all bring to mind that one teacher who was like, oh, your drawing's terrible, what were you thinking? Or that there was that one incident, and we all carry that around somewhere. There is that voice, and that one teacher. I had one teacher in graduate school who, sort of the short version of the story, the first year of the program, it was this very small program. There were only 2 students in it, of which I was one. And it was centered around one teacher. And he was dying of cancer the first year and missed 2/3 of the school year. So I was kind of left twisting in the wind and, figuring it out as best I could. He died over the summer. The next year they brought in a new teacher, and I brought in the work that I had done the first year, which, was like the best I could do given the circumstance. And he kind of just I could picture it, it's burned in my brain. He just dropped the files on my desk and said, I have no idea how you got accepted into this program. And I was like, what? after the, like the first year was so terrible, I've lost a year, and now this is where I'm starting, and, I'm sure that's a very old school pedagogical idea of like, the shock to the system, or you're going to challenge the person, or they're going to be so angry they'll, you get into that energy of like, well, I'll show you. And, I know for a long time with a lot of work I did after that, that energy of like, I will show you, teacher. And I, maybe that was useful at a certain point, just.
Yeah. Well, there was a guy I interviewed once, William Hudson O'Hanlon, and he talked about the 4 motivations, and they were blissed, blessed, pissed, or dissed. And that just is a classic example of dissed.
Yeah.
Right. It's probably not what you want to run on, but it'll get you out the door.
Right. And the thing is, like, there is use to that, but then you also have to reach the point where you're like, I can't sustain what I'm doing just based on that.
So I've just had a thought. Do you think that we develop our inner critic to defend ourselves against the outer critic? Like I just suddenly think it's like I'm going to give myself so much crap about stuff so that nobody out there can give me crap about it until like I've it feels like there's some dynamic there.
That's really interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that for a little bit later. I
just thought of it too. I'm actually not sure.
Really,
on the next show. I
think there is some truth to that, but there are people who are able to be like, I made this thing. It's really cool, and I'm going to put it out there, and it doesn't stop them.
No. I don't think it has to stop you at all.
Yeah.
Anyways. Okay.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I'll just throw in, I always like, Anne Lamott has the best phrase for the inner critic, which is, she calls it the inner terrorist, which I think gives it the full extent of its power. So it's one to watch out for.
Well, I like Elizabeth Gilbert in Big Magic, where she talks about like, it can sit in the back seat and come along for the ride. It can't touch the radio.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not going to drive.
Yeah.
But it's part of the game.
Yeah. And I think there is somebody just did a study on this about, and I can't remember where I read it, but about imposter syndrome, and that there is, and these are very fine degrees, but there is just a little value in the sort of, again, it's an impetus to action of sort of like, I don't know, can I do this? And, that it's okay, again, to sort of not know. Now, if that overwhelms everything, then it's wrong and terrible.
Right. It's okay to not know as long as you come out the other side.
Right. And sort of be like, well, I'm not sure if I should be the one doing this, but okay, I'll give it a shot. That's very different. But it's a very fine degree. It's important to kind of allow space for all of that to exist, because I think sometimes this is one thing I noticed with clients too, in particular in their sense of thinking something's wrong, that people have an idea that it will just flow and this thing will just come. Like once you've tapped into it, it will just come, and you're in this space. And certainly those moments exist, but it doesn't mean something's wrong because it's difficult or it's hard. I always say, the first thing I say to somebody is, it's hard to make something. Like, that's fine. It really is hard.
That doesn't mean there's something wrong.
Right. And, and it, I don't want to say should be, but that's part of the experience, right? Not only are you making the thing, you have to figure out how to make it while you're doing it. So that's not an easy thing.
All right, I'm going to finish with the question. I always finish with this question.
Okay.
So by some weird quirk of fate, I have the ability to ordain anyone emperor of the universe. And I'm going to ordain you. So you will be emperor of the universe. Your decrees must be followed. What's your first decree as emperor of the universe?
I would say make things. Get out there and make things. There's no reason not to, right?
Yeah. Might help, can't hurt.
Yeah, exactly. There's and follow your curiosity. I think that would be the other one.
So, Peter, if people want to find you, where do they find you? We'll put links up. But just
sure. You can reach out via my website, and please do. I love talking to people. I always offer a free hour phone call just to sort of meet people. It gives me a great chance to learn. So you can check my websites at pmkcreativityguide.com, or you can look at my personal website, petermkrask.com, and I'm on Instagram as the Creativity Guide, and also Peter M. Krask.
And I just want to clarify, it's Creativity Guide, not Creativity God. I would be okay either way.
That would be a little presumptuous, don't you think?
Well, I don't know. I just made you emperor of the universe.
I was going to say, you just made me emperor of the
probably
universe.
a step down from that. So
all I say is whoever I encounter next after this conversation better look out. Because
Peter, a real pleasure to meet you.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. And you've given me a lot to think about. I'll have to keep chatting about this.
Nice. All right. Thank you, everybody. We'll talk with you soon. I really hope you enjoyed today's show. You can learn more at michaelneill.org. Please go over to iTunes to subscribe and rate the podcast. Until next time, have fun, learn heaps, and I'll talk with you soon.